Hey, greetings everybody. GleeCon here again with another episode of Lore of Warcraft. On our last episode, we talked about the Curse of the Worgen, kind of like the origin story of the Gilnean Worgen. We know from 10,000 years ago or so that the Worgen have existed as a form of druids for a long time. But they were kind of banished into the Emerald Dream, and Erigol, to help fight off the Scourge, who had worked their way through Silverpine Forest and were attacking Gilneas. He brought them in, and whoopsie, that was a bad idea. They had to slam their gates closed. Now Silverpine is equally infested with Worgen and undead, and there's an infection spreading through Gilneas. Gilneas, I don't know how to say it. All right, stay a while and listen to this one. It's called The Fall of Silvermoon. This is an example of, a lot of the times, especially lately, it's kind of been beat for beat, like Chronicles. We'll just even go beyond. There'll be extra sections. Now, here's an example where basically the entire rest of the Undead campaign is summed up in one Chronicles. And I guess that's also kind of a criticism of this campaign. They take the story beat of taking Silvermoon and they stretch it out for from what I've read online, it overstays its welcome a little bit. But I don't know. We're gonna just see how it goes. But yeah, let's read this bad boy. Far north of Gilneas, Arthas, Menethil, and the Scourge marched into the tranquil woodlands bordering Quel'Thalas. Much to their surprise, they met no resistance. The forests were oddly silent and deserted. It seemed as if the kingdom's high elves had fled in terror before the approaching undead, but nothing could have been further from the truth. The elves were busy preparing for the Scourge. King Anasterian Sunstrider rallied his people into action, but he left the task of organizing the defenses and leading the military to Ranger General Sylvanas Windrunner. Sylvanas came from a distinguished family of high elves. Her sisters Illyria and Verisa had both earned praise for bravery in battle, and we know, I think Illyria is the one that has basically turned into a void elf and has gone off with Turalian, and she will not come back until Legion. And Verisa is the one that's teamed up with Ronan for Day of the Dragon, and she'll be there. I don't know how much she actually does in the game lore. Sylvanas was no exception, and I think she's the oldest. Like her sisters, she had fought on the front lines in the Second War, but when the Orcish horde had invaded Quel'Thalas and burned its woodlands, even before that, she had garnered a reputation as a fearless and cunning ranger while battling trolls from the nearby Amani Empire. Yeah, okay, so we had already known she was kind of a bad butt kicker. Sylvanas ordered most of the kingdom's magi and priests to gather in Silvermoon City, although she did send some to the human forces. I guess that part's done, actually. They're done with that. They would serve as a last line of defense if the Scourge made it to the capital, but the Ranger General hoped that it wouldn't come to that. Sylvanas took the Rangers into the woods outside Silvermoon City, where she planned to mount a resistance so fierce that the undead would turn back. Known as the Far Striders, the Rangers were lightly armored and highly mobile troops. Historically, they stood as the first line of defense against any intruders that threatened Quel'Thalas. It was a dangerous job, but one that carried great honor and prestige. As Arthas, or prestige, if you're doing like Call of Duty, as Arthas and Scourge plunged deeper into the forests, Sylvanas and her rangers launched their attack from all sides. The fighting was fierce and frenzied. The undead moved steadily toward Silvermoon City, but Sylvanas made them pay dearly for every step taken. She was a brilliant tactician, and her dogged persistence infuriated Arthas. The Scourge outnumbered the Rangers, and they would inevitably reach Silvermoon. Sylvanas knew her only hope was to buy the capital's defenders time to prepare for a siege. She ordered her Rangers to make a final stand outside the city. Sylvanas herself would deal with Arthas. In full view of Silvermoon's glorious spires, the Death Knight and the Ranger General clashed. Sylvanas was fearsome, but she was fatigued from days of hard battle. Her strength faded, and Arthas found an opening. Frostmourne tore through the Ranger General and spilled the life from her veins. Death was not the end for Sylvanas Windrunner. Arthas punished the Ranger General for her defiance. He ripped the High Elf's spirit from her body and converted it into a spectral banshee. This act chained Sylvanas to the Lich King's will. She could not disobey him, even though she wanted to. She was forced to take part in the assault on Quel'Thalas and murder her own people, the very people she had sworn to protect to the end of her days. And we know that she becomes undead because she's the leader of the Forsaken. Yeah, that's messed up. I didn't know, like, I'm not too familiar with all of her backstory, so that's messed up that she had to go and kill. And I know they call her the Banshee Queen, even though she looks like a Forsaken, but I guess that's why. Sylvanas' sacrifice had been valiant, but it did not save Silvermoon. Arthas, Menethil, and the Scourge shattered the capital's defenses and cut a path north toward the Isle of Quel'Thalas, home of the Sunwell. So they just rip on through Silvermoon City. King Anastarian Sunstrider and the surviving elves gathered aboard their fleet and retreated to the island. Protecting the Sunwell became their primary focus. They could always rebuild their capital, but the fount of arcane magic was irreplaceable. The Scourge had no ships, and the elves believed it would take time for the undead to find a way to cross the sea. They were mistaken. Arthas did not need a fleet. He had Frostmourne. When he reached the northern coast of Quel'Thalas, he dipped the runeblade into the foaming sea. The water around the weapon froze, and the ice gradually spread across the ocean until a makeshift bridge formed. That would be a cool cutscene. As Arthas and the Scourge marched toward Quel'Thalas, King Anastarian steeled himself for battle. If the elves had any chance of surviving, it lay with him. Anastarian was elderly, but he was wise and crafty, and like Arthas, he wielded a great weapon, an ancient sword known as Felomilon. The king dueled Arthas on the frozen shores of Quel'Thalas. The keening of their two blades shook the sky like thunder. Anastarian lasted much longer against Arthas than most others had, but he was no match for the Death Knight. Neither was Felomilon. With one brutal strike, Arthas Menethil shattered the king's blade. His next blow ended Anastarian's life. Morale crumbled among the remaining High Elf defenders, and the Scourge swept over Quel'Thalas. Very few elves escaped. Victorious, Arthas reached the Sunwell and submerged Kel'Thuzad's remains in its shimmering depths. The Death Knight drew on the fount's boundless magic and wove a spell that remade the fallen necromancer into a terrifying incorporeal lich. This transformation came at great cost to the elves. Turning Kel'Thuzad into a lich befouled the Sunwell. The fount would never be the same again. The Sunwell's corrupted energies gradually permeated Quel'Thalas and the elves who still lived there. So that's crazy that Kel'Thuzad's actually that important, that his essential creation as a lich is what changed an entire race of people. Arthas Menethil did not linger in the kingdom. His work was done. He gathered the Scourge and marched south toward Dalaran, leaving only ruins and death in his wake. The land in Quel'Thalas where he and the undead had set foot festered and died. This wound in the world later became known as the Dead Scar, and it would remain for many years. As a matter of fact, I think it's still there. So that's why it just is a straight line, because they just marched in a straight path through the city. They didn't even stop, and they went all the way to Quel'Thalas. Quel'Thalas. And I bet you, because it says it corrupted the well, that's probably why they turned into the Blood Elves. Okay. We have the Treachery of Darkhan aside. Silvermoon City was protected by a number of magical barriers. Two were the Elf Gates, which were positioned at strategic points on the main road to the capital. The third and most powerful barrier was called Bandinoriel. It was an impenetrable shield that derived its power from the Sunwell. Arthas Menethil and the Scourge might have never bypassed these defenses if not for the High Elf Magister Darkhan Drathir. Darkhan was a talented mage, but unbridled ambition made him arrogant and vindictive. He never felt that he received the recognition he deserved. Bitterness filled his heart and darkened his emotions. Arthas sensed Darkhan's inner turmoil, and he saw him as a critical ally for the invasion of Quel'Thalas. The Death Knight whispered in the elf's mind and made an offer. If he served the Lich King, all the power and recognition Darkhan craved would finally be his. Darkhan could not resist. He betrayed his entire race and helped the Scourge destroy and bypass Quel'Thalas' magical barriers. And I think you may get that story if you do all the quests for the Blood Elves. And perhaps Darkhan becomes a lich. I don't know. We'll have to see. And here we have a painting of Arthas walking away after killing Sylvanas. It says Arthas Menethel's victory over Sylvanas Windrunner in Quel'Thalas. And look, her eyes are like white because she's about to become the Banshee Queen. Poor Sylvanas. And I think there's a new book that just came out within the past year that details her like life story, kind of like the way they did with Illidan. All right, cool. We got another episode in the pipe, 5x5. That was an important one. And I think there's actually a lot of little side lore that talks about this war between the Lich King and the Elves. Basically, the Undead campaign that we'll get to really soon. Alrighty, I would thank everybody so much for watching and listening, and I look forward to seeing you next time on Lore of Warcraft.